Hi, and welcome to the WellnessFX video tutorial where we talk about some of the nutritional components found on a blood chemistry, specifically iron, ferritin, which is a stored form of iron, folic acid, vitamin B12, as well as magnesium, specifically red blood cell magnesium, and that's magnesium found within the red blood cell and not just serum. So let's start talking just at the top. Iron is a metal. In fact, it's one of the most toxic metals to the human body. Beyond things like mercury or aluminum, iron by itself is highly toxic, and it does so by something that's called the Fenton reaction. And what you can see here is you have a couple different forms of iron. You have the ferrous or +2 form and the ferric or +3 form. Excess iron can react with oxygen, essentially donate an electron, and create, in red here, what's called a superoxide radical. Now, I don't think I need to explain what a superoxide radical does because the name itself pretty much tells you that this is a fairly potent free radical, therefore causing damage to the DNA, to the mitochondria, or to the cells of the body. So excess iron, along with some oxygen, can create this ferric form of iron, and as well as this superoxide radical. But now that we have this ferric form, if you have the ferric form of iron, it can react with hydrogen peroxide, which itself is somewhat oxidative, and then form back to the ferrous form, and in red what are called 2 hydroxyl ions or radicals. These two are free radicals that can cause oxidative damage. Either way that you look at this, the ferric and ferrous form can interact with things that are normally found in the body, and in either case produce a very toxic byproduct or some type of free radical or oxidant, and then the byproduct of the, in this case, ferric form turns into the ferrous form, which can go through this process here. Either way you look at it, excess iron can cause massive oxidative stress, and therefore mitochondrial damage, DNA damage, or just damage to the cells of the body. Now, serum iron, in my personal experience, is not one of the more accurate markers, and I say that because there's been a number of times where a patient had, let's say, high or low iron levels. We sent them back for a more complete iron workup, and the iron was considerably different even just a few days later. But similar to glucose, it's something that you always would want to have on a blood chemistry because it just helps paint a bigger picture of what you're looking at. If iron levels are ever low, you can't really make the assessment as to whether or not that individual has actual low iron stores or not. To do so, you really need to then talk about ferritin. Ferritin is a protein that embeds iron on the inside of it, really protecting the body from that very toxic iron. So ferritin is a stored form of iron. It's really just a protein synthesized by most of the cells of the body. Ferritin levels therefore, are a much better representation of actual iron status in the body. So if iron levels are low on a blood chemistry, just serum iron, if it's low, the recommendation is to not recommend iron supplementation with that individual unless you absolutely know that they're deficient in iron, as would be evidenced by low ferritin levels. If ferritin levels are low, because that's the stored form of iron, if they're low, then that person probably is iron deficient and may actually benefit from iron supplementation. But until you know that they are definitively low in iron, I personally would not recommend iron supplementation for the following reasons that I just talked about. On the other hand, if iron is excessively high, the same thing. It may be somewhat of a spurious result. I've seen that happen before. And really, if iron levels were high, you may be looking at excess oxidative stress, though it may be temporary, and what you want to do is really follow up with ferritin. If ferritin is elevated, the possible cause of that, including high iron, would be iron overload. Now, in individuals with the conditions hemochromatosis or hemosiderosis, now they might have high ferritin because it's an iron overload situation. You may also see high ferritin in people that consume an abundance of alcohol or alcoholism, for example. High ferritin may also be acute inflammation. And there's a number of different proteins that are synthesized by the body that are considered to be acute phase reactants. Now what that means is in the presence of acute inflammation that a number of these proteins increase synthesis in the body. Other acute phase reactants similar to ferritin include things like fibrinogen and C-reactive protein. So if ferritin is high and you have things like fibrinogen or C-reactive protein and they too are also both high, then the reason for the high ferritin may be inflammation in the body. If ferritin is high but CRP and fibrinogen are normal, then what you may be looking at is some kind of iron overload. Other possible reasons for low ferritin. The number one cause would likely be low iron, but include things like vitamin C deficiency might contribute to this, as well as things like hypothyroidism. Or, in the case of liver production, though ferritin is not exclusively produced by the liver, if the liver wasn't working very well, then possibly you might see low ferritin as well. But if ferritin is low and iron is low, then you want to consider that individual is low in iron. The question then is, why are they low in iron? Now, there are things that can impact iron absorption in the gastrointestinal tract. For example, high levels of tea, green tea for example, can actually impede the absorption of a number of different particular metals. Things like vitamin C, on the other hand, can actually increase iron absorption in the gastrointestinal tract. So perhaps it's intake. Maybe they're consuming a low protein diet. Maybe they're vegetarian or vegan, and most of the iron that they're consuming is found in vegetables, and that's not really considered to be the most absorbable type of iron. Maybe it's an absorption issue. Maybe there's some gastrointestinal tract inflammation going on. Maybe they're consuming a number of different things that can actually impact the absorption of iron. Or in the case of iron, the other possibility is maybe loss, specifically with blood. So if somebody has a bleeding disorder, or if it's a woman who has a menstrual cycle that has really heavy cycles, for example, she may be losing enough iron in that particular time of the month that her iron stores never really fully recover before the next monthly or menstrual cycle. So iron's highly toxic. If it's low, you may be looking at some kind of intake, absorption, or a blood loss issue. If it's high, maybe it's excess consumption. You might want to ask about things like if they're consuming, if they're cooking on cast iron skillets, or if the pipes in their house are made of iron, for example. That can be a source of high iron. Ferritin is a much more stable marker, however, of iron. If it's low, chances are it's low iron stores in the body and they're iron deficient. If it's high, it might be iron overload. It also might be things like an acute phase reactant for inflammation. The next two are two B vitamins. Folic acid is also known as vitamin B9, and then there's B12, which is also known as cobalamin. Now, these two vitamins actually work very similar to one another. They're both involved in what are called methylation reactions, but really at their core, and while things like B12 is involved with cellular metabolism, fatty acid synthesis, and brain function, both of these are very much intimately involved with DNA. DNA synthesis, DNA repair, cell proliferation, cell differentiation, and so B12 and folic acid are very fundamental in just basic DNA processes in the body. Again, synthesis, repair, cell proliferation, and differentiation. And if somebody's deficient in either folic acid or B12, then they may have issues with that. And if you looked at the CBC video that talked about red blood cell production, remember that the red blood cells, as they're being produced in the bone marrow, have a fairly large nucleus, very active nucleus. It has to mature and shrink in order to become a fully functional red blood cell. If somebody is deficient in B12 or folic acid, the nucleus doesn't mature properly, and what you end up with is an overly large red blood cell, like a macrocytic, hyperchromic type of situation. Now, serum B12 and folic acid, these are not considered to be very sensitive markers of absolute folic acid or absolute B12 deficiency. And the reason why is that these two particular markers not only relate to one another, but are very impacted by one's diet. Folic acid, for example, is found in fairly high amounts in green leafy vegetables like foliage, hence its name folate or folic acid, and B12 is almost exclusively found in meats. So if somebody, for example, is following a vegan or vegetarian diet, chances are they probably have adequate amounts of folate, but may be deficient in B12. What's curious about this is if you watch the video on homocysteine and how B12 and folic acid work together in order to reduce homocysteine, if somebody has a really severe B12 deficiency, their folic acid may actually be elevated on a blood chemistry. Not normal, but elevated. And the reason why is because there's so much of the active form of folic acid in the blood, which is 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. Because it's not able to donate its methyl group, it remains very high in the blood, even higher than maybe normal values, despite the fact that it's just normal folic acid intake. But because of an excessive B12 deficiency, that folic acid may look high. So if you see somebody that has low or low normal B12 and an elevated folic acid or folate on a blood chemistry, you may be looking at a fairly significant B12 deficiency. On the other hand, B12 is very much impacted by dietary consumption of B12 and may not look at an active deficiency, let's just say cellularly. So if somebody's taking B12 supplements, chances are they're probably not deficient in B12, and chances are their B12 in the serum may be actually somewhat high because of their intake of B vitamin or B12. So these are not very sensitive markers per se, but on the other hand, it can definitely offer some insight as to somebody's folate and B12 levels. These are very good to correlate with homocysteine. If homocysteine is high, and let's say B12 is low and folic acid is very high, that's probably a B12 deficiency. If homocysteine is elevated and perhaps folic acid is deficient, but B12 might be normal, then again, what you might be looking at is an actual folic acid deficiency, and that's why homocysteine is also high. So it's really good to be able to correlate, especially homocysteine, to bring more accuracy to these two markers. Lastly, magnesium. Now, magnesium is a mineral that's used in over 300 different reactions in the body. And without going into the detail of all those different reactions, it can basically be summarized into this. That in the body, we can have ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate. This can have added to it an inorganic phosphate, turning it into ATP, which we all know as energy. And magnesium, turns out, is very much involved with that last addition of that phosphate. So without magnesium, you can see that really cellular function on almost all the cells of the body may be deficient because you just can't add that last phosphate onto ADP to make ATP. Magnesium is also known to be a muscle relaxant. It's considered to be nature's calcium channel blocker. That calcium and magnesium in many ways have antagonistic effects of one another. And so magnesium is critically important in a number of different things. Many individuals with cardiovascular disease have been shown to be deficient in magnesium. And when looking at what cardiovascular disease actually is it can be an inefficiency of the heart. And why is there inefficiency? Because of a lack of ATP. And possibly the lack of ATP is due to magnesium deficiency. Magnesium may be low in individuals that consume large amounts of alcohol. For example, very often will be low in people with blood sugar disorders like insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and type 2 diabetes. And in any case, the reason why WellnessFX has chosen the red blood cell magnesium and not serum magnesium is red blood cell magnesium is more sensitive to deficiency than serum magnesium, meaning serum magnesium is the last magnesium marker to show deficiency. We don't want to wait that long to see that somebody's deficient in magnesium. We want to catch it earlier because it's involved with so many very important processes in the body. So the RBC, or red blood cell form of magnesium, is a much more sensitive marker looking for deficiency. If somebody is low in magnesium, then you can consider incorporating foods that are high in magnesium, or honestly, because of magnesium's very important role in the body, consider supplementation with these individuals. The way that we particularly do it is usually we'll start at around 200 milligrams every couple of hours, for example, throughout the day. And they may reach what's called bowel tolerance, meaning that they may actually start to develop loose stools. Let's say, for example, they've taken 4 200 milligram capsules a couple hours apart. They've reached 800 milligrams. They start to develop some loose stools. Back them off to about 600 milligrams. It's not the only way to do it, but that's something that we've found to be somewhat successful. And you may actually not see an improvement in the red blood cell magnesium for a few months after supplementation, so give it some time. Retest about 3 months later to see if the red blood cell magnesium levels are actually increasing. So this is a few of the nutritional markers found on the WellnessFX blood chemistry panels, and I will see you in another video.